What is up, guys? Pie Muffin here, and today we're going to be talking about Trails to Zero, or Trails from Zero. Sorry, sometimes they always change the second word, and I sometimes get confused and forget. Trails from Zero and Trails to Owl, or Trails to Azure, as it would be in English if it ever got localized. So the thing about these games, and, obviously spoilers moving forward if you have not played the games. If you have not seen my Trails in the Sky trilogy kind of review, kind of like my thoughts on it, kind of like my experience, this is going to be kind of like that. So I'm going to be talking about what I liked, what I didn't like, what I felt was different, all that kind of stuff. But since these games are not localized, I'm sure there's a lot of people who watch this video who haven't played the game. So if you don't want to be spoiled on certain things, this may not be the video for you. Now, I do want to preface this by saying, if you are maybe you're someone who's played the 3 Sky games and you played Cold Steel 1, 2, and 3, and you're waiting for Cold Steel 4, which does drop towards the end of October over here in the West, I highly recommend, either getting the Geofront version of the game. Geofront is kind of a group of people who are working on a localization for a PC version of... they already have a fully done version for Zero, and they're working on Azure right now. So you can either do that, you can either wait for that, you can play through Zero and then wait for the Azure, or you can do what most people are doing and just watch a playthrough on YouTube. You'll find plenty of channels that have done full playthroughs, whether you want to watch someone, kind of react as they're playing it, or you just want a quiet playthrough. They're definitely on there. I've seen them. But I will say it will be necessary. This is kind of not related to what we're going to be talking about, but knowing the story from these 2 games, the Crossbell arc, as it's called, is going to be necessary for... I'd say, honestly, I'm probably about halfway through Cold Steel 3 right now, and I'd say it's necessary for Cold Steel 3. Some people would argue it's only references. It's really not. There's an entire chapter of the game that has to do with the Crossbell stuff, so I highly recommend, but you can play Cold Steel 1 and 2 just fine without knowing the Crossbell stuff, but definitely before you start Cold Steel 3, or if you've already played Cold Steel 3, go back and watch that stuff, and then replay Cold Steel 3. To fully understand everything that's going on. Because Cold Steel 4 and Hajimari no Kiseki, whatever that's going to be called in English, some people said it might be called Trails from Beginnings or something like that, which actually just released in Japan, so it'll be a year and a half before we get it. Those games are heavily focused on the characters from both the Sky games and the Crossbell games, so I highly recommend that you know the story. I see that there are, review summaries, and I'll be done with this little kind of, side thing in a minute, and we'll talk about the games. There are these, little summaries, but you really don't get the full experience of what happens in those games just knowing the plot. Knowing the overall plot, I guess if you're not a huge story person, then that's cool. That works for you, but I wouldn't understand someone playing the series and not being a huge, kind of story and storyline buff. Anyways, enough about that. I just wanted to put that out there for people who are either new to the series or, maybe don't know about the side games too much and they've only played, Cold Steel. And I just highly recommend that you know all the story to understand everything moving forward, because the future games will not make any sense overall if you don't know those. Anyways, back to what we're talking about here. We're going to be talking about Zero and Azure, which before Cold Steel 3, those were the games I played. So I think the following day after I finished Sky the Third, I went straight. I made sure I got the Geofront version of Zero installed on my PC. And then there was also a I don't know if you call it a mod or whatever you want to call it, but I basically installed something, so I got the Evo version. So the game was fully voiced. If you don't know what the Evo version is, basically for the 3 Sky games and for the Crossbell games, they have a voice patch, which they did, when they re-released those versions of the games. I think it was on, I don't know what the Sky versions came out on, but I think on it was either the PSP or the Vita, where the Crossbell games got re-released and they were fully voiced, for the most part. So I did do that because, you know, it definitely enhances the experience, which is kind of weird because playing through Cold Steel 3, you know, it's back to being kind of jarring when something is voiced and it's suddenly not voiced. But so that's what I did for Zero. For Azure, let's just say I downloaded the game through in English through other means. You can take that how you want it, and if you can find it, then you find it. But I do not, just because it's not localized, I don't condone, you know, advertising it. But it is out there to play one way or another. That's all I'll say on that. But I have to say, I think the Crossbell arc of this series is probably my favorite, just character and story-wise. You know, I played Cold Steel 1 and 2 first, and I really loved Class 7 and everything that kind of went on with them. And then I went back to Sky, and I really like the Sky characters, but I still think I'd put the Cold Steel characters above the Sky characters in terms of how much I liked them. But I think once I got to Crossbell, it's like, I think the issue with, especially with Cold Steel and a little bit with Sky by the end of it, is that there are too many characters. I think that's what, I don't know what happened in between where they decided a smaller, you know, for the Crossbell games was, a smaller party was better, but I think it worked out very, very well. You know, in the first game, you pretty much just have 4 playable characters. There are characters that will join you for, as like guest characters, which if you've played any of the other Trails games, you'll know what a guest character is. It's basically someone who doesn't stay in your party for the whole game. So you'll see that in Zero, like, quite frequently throughout the game. It'll be like, oh, well, this character who's pretty plot relevant, like Dudley, for example, there are a couple times where Dudley will be in your party, but he's not an actual, like, full party member. But it's pretty much just the group of Lloyd, Ellie, I almost called her Elise, I don't know why, Tio, and Randy. So it's a very interesting, you know, group of characters, but even in the second game, it's not even that expanded, you know. Wazy from the Testaments, which, like I said, these are spoilers, so I'm not going to spend the entire video explaining which character is what. But, so Wazy from the Testaments is basically a full party member, and Noel, basically from the military, is also a full party member. So by the end of the Crossbell arc, you do have a main party of 6 characters. Now, like I said, there are guest characters who are pretty important, but they don't join you for the full time. Like, for example, the final dungeon for Zero, Estelle and Joshua from the Liberal arc, you know, the Sky Trilogy, are in your party, which is actually really good. That was a really cool thing that they kind of did there. And, you know, based on what I've seen for, like, so I'm not trying to spoil too much, but screenshots for Cold Steel 4, it seems like it's going to start, you know, bringing a lot of characters back from the past. You know, Cold Steel 3 already kind of does that. You know, each chapter has, like, a character that you might know, you know, from previous games that's in your party that hasn't been playable in a Cold Steel game before. So I always find that kind of fun. But it seems like Cold Steel 4 is really going to go all out on that, which is why I also said before, you know, it's really important that you know the stories to these games. Now, going back to kind of the structure of the Crossbell games, it was very interesting to kind of go back to, because all 3 games, and, you know, people might try to argue this, and it's actually, they make fun of it in the games, like, all the time after the Sky Trilogy, that the SSS, which is the support section, special support section, which is the police that Lloyd and Co. are a part of, and of course Class 7, when they go on their field studies, they are basically just makeshift bracers. And that's what's, you know, which is kind of funny because it almost feels more structured in the newer games than it did in the original. You know, in the Sky games, if you wanted to grab any of those side jobs, you actually had to go to the board and be like, okay, I'm gonna select this monster extermination, this person lost their wedding ring, I'm gonna help them find this. But in both the Crossbell and Cold Steel games, it's almost mandatory that you pick some of those up. You don't have to do them all, you know, the ones that are required you have to do, but it's really at the beginning of the Crossbell games when they started to have that structure of, okay, this is today, you're going to be doing these jobs, these two are required, and the rest of these you can choose whether to do them or not. They'll have some fun side story if you want to do them or not. So it was a very interesting experience to kind of go back to that formula of, okay, here's the plot line for today. Let's go do this side stuff to get some extra, Mira and stuff like that, some accessories, and then go on and do the story. I'm really not... It still had more freedom than Cold Steel, because in the Crossbell games, obviously the entire game takes place in Crossbell and the surrounding towns. But which is still more freedom, because even on... Unless there's like a specific story thing where you're like stuck in a specific village, or you're stuck in Crossbell in a specific area, for the most part, you have free roam of the entire kind of map. Whereas in a Cold Steel game, when you go on your field study or whenever you're doing the stuff, you're either in town, where the school is, or you're at the location of the field study. There's some freedom in the second, like Cold Steel 2 had a little more freedom because of with everything going on, you were basically flying around the country. But in the first games, you're always kind of like, it's like you're here, just follow the linear line for the most part and kind of stick with it. So it was kind of nice that the Crossbell games were kind of like a bridge between that. It had the freedom of the Sky games, where you kind of could pretty much go where you want most of the time, but you also had these daily activities to where you had to do specific things at specific times. It was really I think the most exciting thing for me, or just interesting, was since I played the first two Cold Steel games, I think 0 takes place before Cold Steel 1, but by the end of Azure, if I can say Azure, whatever, pretty much Cold Steel 2 and Azure are pretty much lined up, one for one. Except for the end of Cold Steel, once you've actually ended Cold Steel 2 and you get that little aftermath part, with Reen and Crossbell, that's when it's after Azure. But up until that point, they pretty much both end pretty much at the exact same point, because once you deal with the Azure tree, that's pretty much where the game ends. You get this little, final thing where you see, the support section, everyone goes, where they're gonna go. They go their separate ways. Weishi goes back to the church, and he takes Wald with him, which I still think is funny. See what's going to come out of that. And then Noelle goes back to the military. And then, of course, everyone's part of the support section. But we know the day after they deal with the Azure Tree is basically when the Empire invades. And then Rufus becomes the basically new mayor of Crossbell, because they basically take it over. Which is really interesting to kind of see that storyline continue into the end of Cold Steel 2. And then, of course, into Cold Steel 3 and beyond. Especially since one of the main characters for Cold Steel 3 is actually from Crossbell. Gameplay-wise, it wasn't too different from the Sky games. There were some differences, like the burst mechanic, which is really interesting. Because, unless I'm mistaken, the burst mechanic starts in Azure. That's the first time I don't think you use it in 0. I'm pretty sure you don't. You use it in Azure, and then it disappears in Cold Steel 1, but comes back in Cold Steel 2, and then it's gone again in Cold Steel 3. So I wonder when they decide to kind of bring that mechanic back, or, what have you. But I find it I wonder if it'll be back. It'll probably be back in Cold Steel 4. Maybe it's just like the second game of everything. They keep it there because the characters are more developed at that point. What else was there? Oh, and I guess the other thing to kind of note here is the Crossbell games was kind of when they started to go more towards the kind of shonen aspects, as well as the kind of love interest kind of choice type thing, because obviously in the Sky games, it's just Estelle and Joshua. They are the couple. Estelle's the main character. There's no reason for Estelle to have her harem of men that are, fawning over her. But of course, in the Crossbell arc, Lloyd and, this joke goes on and on, that Lloyd just has, this baby face and all the girls fall for him and that stuff. And it's the same thing with Reen, of course. And they make fun of that too, where I actually find it funny in Cold Steel 3 where Randy basically tells Rean he's exactly like Lloyd in that aspect, where he always has women going over him and how unfair it is. But yeah, back to gameplay. The gameplay was more or less the same. We had the burst mechanic that was a new addition from, that wasn't in the Sky games. But for the most part, everything else pretty much stayed the same. Your typical crafts, your typical arts. You had your S-crafts. And the big difference was the addition of dual crafts, which, interesting that, they had actual dual crafts for characters, but then in Cold Steel, we don't really have dual crafts for characters, at least not that I can remember in the first 3 Cold Steel games. I don't know if it's beyond, and I don't want to know because, I'll play Cold Steel 4 when it comes out here in 2 months. I think it's actually 2 months from today when it actually releases. But it's just very interesting to me when they kind of pick and choose what they decide to put in or take out. Character and story-wise, I think it's very well written. They do make references to stuff that happens in Liberal, but it's not dependent on the stuff that happens in Liberal. You deal with Estelle and Joshua for the majority of the first game. You can go to the Bracer Guild and check up on what they're doing. And of course, Ren is actually pretty pivotal to the story as well, considering you would have died, which you actually did die, but then Kia reversed time and made it so you didn't die. It's very complicated how that stuff happens. And Kia's another thing. She was a very interesting plot device for the second game. In the first game, she wasn't so much of a plot device. She didn't really have too much to do until you find out in the second game. But I'll be very curious to see in like Cold Steel, 4 and beyond, like what her kind of role is going to be, considering she doesn't have her powers anymore. But I think overall what I'd like to say about this game is I think it really thrived because it had a smaller cast. By the second game, like I said, there was only 6 playable characters. And it was actually very interesting because some of the characters had their full character arc happen in the first game, but then there were some characters that don't have their arc happen until the second game, which I think gives you more freedom to kind of develop those characters. There's a lot of JRPGs that, and this is for Trails in general, but there are a lot of JRPGs that are only one game, so you have to cram, if you have 7, 8, 9, characters in your JRPG story, you have to cram all their story arcs into one game. But with Trails, you don't even have to save it for one arc. Ren didn't get her full arc kind of completed until the Crossbell games, but she was a Sky character. So, over the course of these, in English, there are currently 8 localized games, and we'll have the 9th in October, and then the 10th, in a year and a half or something like that. But, there's no rush to kind of have these character arcs just kind of be thrown out there. So that's what I also like about this, is that even in these 2 games, it never felt like these character arcs were rushed, and the bonds and everything that these characters developed did feel very real and authentic. But that's pretty much it. That's all what I mainly want. I got off track quite a number of times because everything is... It would have been so much easier if I had just started with the Sky games and I hadn't played anything else, because then I could have given a direct review on the game itself. But since I've played, 6.5 of these games, or 7.5 of these games, it's very hard to kind of keep stuff confined to one thing. But let me know what you guys think down below. If you guys have played the Crossbell games, let me know which your... by the way, Crossbell games have the best soundtrack, in my opinion. Except for I've heard some Hajimari tracks since the game is released, and, that they're actually pretty fire. But let me know what you guys think of the Crossbell games. Let me know who your favorite character is in the Crossbell games. And let me know what you're excited to, no spoilers. If you know stuff, don't post a spoiler down below. But let me know what you're excited to see the Crossbell characters do in Cold Steel 4 and beyond, if you don't have prior knowledge to what they do. Because I'm very interested to see what people think. Because Cold Steel 4 seems like it's going to be a huge game. And I do plan to... I said this with Cold Steel 3, but I put a post... seeing how much in it, because depending on the interaction, I was either just going to play it on my own or do like a stream or do a playthrough. But there was really only there was 80 people total that voted, and I think 75% voted that they wanted to see me do a playthrough. So that's really only 60 people, so, you know, it just wouldn't have been ideal for YouTube for 60 views a video, and then, of course, it would dip after the first couple videos. So, if I do a playthrough on Cold Steel 4, I'll probably try doing it in video format at first. And if video format doesn't work, like if I go 2 or 3 videos and we're not even hitting like 100 views on those, I either will switch to doing it in stream format, just because I can just chill with all of you and, you know, kind of just play the game. Or I'll just end up playing it on my own and do a review afterwards. But that'll be up to the engagement we kind of get with that. Plus, it's like 2 months away, so we have time. But that's going to be it, guys. Thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more if you're new to the channel. I'll see you all next time. Have a wonderful day, everyone.